So what happened was the political separation between Saipan and Rota and Guam in 1898. And of course, when I say Saipan, I include all of the Northern Marianas, of which Saipan was the administrative capital. So this was the first time in modern history of the Chamorros that one people were politically divided. And it was thanks to foreign intervention. Our political separation was not of our own doing. In 1898, the US took Guam and Guam alone away from the Spaniards. The US wasn't interested in taking all of the islands. One was good enough. The biggest one in the group and the one with the best harbor, because the value of Guam to the US was military. Had the US taken all of the Marianas, we probably wouldn't be here talking about Saipan interpreters in World War II. Next slide. In 1899, Spain sold the Northern Marianas to Germany. So up until 40 years ago, there were Chamorros in Saipan who learned their prayers in German and could speak basic German and sing a few German songs. But then, next slide. In 1914, Japan took over the Northern Marianas from Germany. Now, the language of government, education, and commerce became Japanese. But here was a major difference between the Americanization of Guam and the Japanization of Saipan. What was that difference? Saipan experienced a huge influx of Japanese, far outnumbering the Chamorros and Carolinians. In the pre-war American administration of Guam, that didn't happen. The Americans didn't or outnumber the Chamorros on Guam, but in Saipan, the Japanese did. Let's look at the next slide. So just to show you numbers, in 1937, just a few years before the war, there were almost 3,000 Chamorros and Carolinians in Saipan, and there were almost 21,000 Japanese. So try and get the feeling of being Chamorro in Saipan in the 1930s, and everything around you is Japanese. Chamorro is mainly just for the home, the farm, and church. So if you were born in the 1910s in Saipan or Rota, you received a Japanese education in the 1920s, limited by a Japanese education. So by the time you were in your 20s, the war had just started, you were very good in the Japanese language. Some were so good, next slide. Some Chamorros were so good in Japanese, like Juan Blas Blanco, that he was sent to Japan to become as good in Japanese as the Japanese. There he is, this young Chamorro lad standing up in class in Japan. So as the Japanese were preparing for war, when they knew they would invade Guam and occupy Guam, they knew they would need interpreters. And there they were, a whole generation of 20-something-year-old Chamorros from Saipan and Rota, who from childhood, that's all they knew, were educated in the Japanese language. So obviously the Japanese are going to want these interpreters to meet certain requirements to get the job done. To be an interpreter, you need some qualifications. So what would those be? Next slide. First and foremost, obviously, was language fluency. If you weren't skilled in the Japanese language, you not only wouldn't get the job done, you'd probably become a source of frustration to the Japanese. Can you imagine an interpreter asking the Japanese, what did he mean? The higher up the ladder as an interpreter you went, the better language skills you needed. So the highest ranking interpreters from Saipan and Rota, those guys who really knew Japanese well dealt with the top Japanese commanders, because they had to discuss matters of policy and make big decisions. So that level of Japanese was required. The second requirement was loyalty. Obviously, you couldn't doubt the loyalty of your own interpreters. And there was a simple test of this loyalty. See, language ability you evaluated from actual dialogue with an interpreter, but you tested his loyalty by telling him to do something he didn't want to do or found hard to do. And if he did it, then he was loyal. And all the interpreters did it. But not all of them did it out of love for Japan. Obedience you can measure. Either the person obeys or doesn't. Inner loyalty, love, is harder to gauge. And many of the interpreters themselves said they obeyed, but they obeyed out of fear. And we'll talk more about that later. The third thing you wanted in an interpreter was health. Younger, healthy men were needed because the work was, in some part, physical. Interpreters went out to the fields to interpret for farm crews or construction crews, building airstrips or defenses. Interpreters were told to dig graves as well for the people the Japanese had executed. In 1944, the interpreters worked under war conditions, meaning American bombs were falling. So they faced constant physical danger. So a weak or sickly interpreter was a liability, not an asset. So when you look at the demographics of the Saipanese chosen to be interpreters, they were younger, generally late teens or early 20s, and healthy males. The fourth trait was not a very firm one, simply because most of the interpreters were young men. So therefore, most of them weren't married yet. But not having a wife or children to care for was an asset when the Japanese were choosing what males to be interpreters. The bachelor interpreter had less to take him away from his duties. But human nature being what it is, the Japanese allowed some interpreters to get married. And some of them got married even during the war and even here on Guam. So I personally knew a woman, she's passed, from Saipan, who was married on Guam to her Saipanese interpreter husband. And let's look at the next slide. So the work of interpreting was done in many settings. So we're looking at where interpreters were needed. Well, an interpreter might be needed in a school, for example. A Japanese civilian would typically teach the children of Guam in Japanese, and the interpreter would be there to help. Civil affairs needed to operate under the Japanese. People still needed to register for this or that, or get permits for this or that. So Japanese clerks doing all that paperwork needed Chamorro interpreters when normal government paperwork needed to be done. The Japanese put the Guam Chamorros to work. Guam had to produce as much food as possible on its own. Ships couldn't travel in wartime and bring imported goods. So as much local food had to be produced, and not just for the Chamorros of Guam, but also for the Japanese military. The Guam Chamorros had to feed the Japanese military as much as possible. So the Japanese really stressed agricultural production. And so interpreters were needed to make sure instructions were understood. By 1943, the Japanese knew that the Americans were coming. So interpreters were needed to make sure the forced Chamorro labor knew what was the job that day. Was it digging ditches or caves or building airfields? Let's go to the next slide. Now here's where the real problem lay. Because interpreters were also needed for the Japanese police. There was the ordinary police force that even included some Guam Chamorro police officers. Their job was to handle ordinary crimes, stealing chickens, bootlegging, public drunkenness, and things like that. But then there was also the military police, the Kempei type, and this was more serious. They dealt with threats against the Japanese military and their security. So anyone suspected of helping George Tweed, for example, or you were suspected of hiding a radio and listening to American news, or anyone speaking against the Japanese, hiding weapons, things like that. That was, of course, a matter of grave concern to the Japanese. So the next slide, please. So the difficulty here was that the Chamorro police interpreter was more than an interpreter. The Chamorro police interpreter was himself an enforcer. He was told by his Japanese superior to investigate, arrest, interrogate, and get answers, even if that included beatings. In a few executions, the Japanese swung the sword, but the Saipan interpreter dug the grave and did the burying. Next slide. And so during the occupation, you really had two kinds of Chamorro interpreters. The majority, there were about 150 interpreters from Saipan and a few from Rota. The majority were just the simple, ordinary interpreter who did just that, interpret. Tell the Chamorro on Guam what the Japanese wanted done. The second kind of interpreter was also an enforcer. Now, not everybody can be a police officer, a soldier, or a law enforcement agent. You need a special set of skills for that. You need to have the physical ability to rough someone up. You need the right kind of temperament. And in the Japanese system at the time and under war conditions, the arrested could be punched and beaten and tortured. And the Chamorro interpreter selected to do these things had to have the physical ability to do that and the mental frame of mind that allowed him to do that. And this did not fit the average Chamorro interpreter. But the Japanese were able to discern who fit that description. As many a Saipan Chamorro told me, these interpreters were rough with their own people. Father Jose, if it were possible for him to be here, would say that everyone in his family told him that his uncle by marriage, Juan Castro, better known as Juan Buco, he was just a rough guy. He was just, I guess we could say he was a bully of some sorts. So these select men were just rough. That was their temperament. But they were in the minority. Most interpreters were just doing language translation. So next slide, please. So what did they do? How did they rough up people? Well, besides one documented case of rape and one of attempted rape, the vast majority of abuses were beatings. Most of the time, quick, temporary beatings, but also all day, all night beatings. Beatings for serious accusations to beatings for simply being late to work. Almost always, these beatings were on orders from the Japanese. Next slide. But some of these beatings resulted in death. That's how bad some of these beatings were. And in many cases, permanent scars or physical disability. 5 deaths of Guam Chamorros were attributed to Saipan interpreters. 4 of them were the result of beatings. And one case was a case of self-defense, according to the defendant interpreter, as he claimed the man he killed took out a revolver. And so you have the list of the names there of the people who were of Guam who were killed. So Pedro Gogui Sablan was beaten in jail with a baseball bat and broomstick. Vicente Sahagong Babauta was beaten in jail. Joaquin Cruz Mafnas was accused of aiding Dumanal, who I'll talk about at the bottom of the slide. And Francisco Cruz Salas accused of having dynamite. And the one case of self-defense, the victim in this case was Pedro Guevara Dumanal, who the Saipan interpreter defendant said had a gun. And Pedro was suspected of assisting Tweed in some way. And Pedro was a very stubborn, uncooperative man. So he was accused by the Japanese of being insubordinate. Okay, so I wanted to include the names of these 5 deaths on Guam. Okay, next. Now, these 13, I'll back up. So when the Americans retook Guam, 13 Saipan and Rota interpreters were charged with war crimes. That's 13 out of 50 interpreters. So only, so about 25%. I think I said 150, I meant 50. Total number of interpreters recruited from Saipan and Rota. So 13 out of 50 is 25%. They were provided lawyers and the ability to produce their own witnesses at the war crimes trial. The jury they faced, however, was made up entirely of American military officers, and all were found guilty. So what happened was in July of '44, when the Americans came back to Guam, not all 50 interpreters were still on Guam. Many interpreters came and went back to Saipan or Rota. But those who were still here on Guam fled to the jungles of northern Guam and were, over the space of weeks, if not months, were arrested and identified. So Guam Chamorros would say, hey, he's a Saipan interpreter. And they were put in a stockade for Japanese military prisoners, but also Japanese civilians and even local Japanese, Guam Japanese and their descendants. Some of them were put in the stockade until they were cleared. Many times they were cleared very quickly, but some weren't. And even a local Japanese was arrested and tried. But the Saipan interpreters in the stockade would, the American investigators would do some investigation about their time on Guam. And if people came forward and said, well, that guy did this, then he was liable to be arrested and face trial at the war crimes trial. So next slide, please. These 13 interpreters do not represent all the cases of abuse committed during the occupation. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the 13 who actually faced trial isn't the complete story A to Z, because a good number of interpreters were never found after the war. And so they're presumed dead. And so these presumed dead interpreters were unable to be prosecuted, assuming that any of them would have been accused. But the reason why some of them were never found after the war is because people said, there's no hard evidence for this, But people said that some of those Saipan interpreters who went missing, like Wambuco, were the more notorious ones, the ones who had really roughed up and got some Guam Chamorros in trouble. And there was the speculation, only speculation, that these missing Saipan interpreters were killed by Guam Chamorros who wanted to take vengeance. Again, this is we're not able to prove anything at the moment. Who knows what grave could be dug up and what bones could be found and what evidence could be found in those graves. So a good number of these interpreters, as I said, moved up north following the Japanese military. And as the US forces kept moving north, they couldn't, eventually they faced the cliffs of northern Guam and couldn't move anymore. We have no evidence that any Chamorro took his or her life, but it's possible. But given their Christian religion, it seems less likely. It's more likely that they were killed by bullets or shrapnel and possibly even by their own Japanese superiors. It's not unheard of that a Japanese, knowing that they would all face death at the hands of the Americans, killed their subordinates and then killed themselves. So we don't know the facts of the case. It's very difficult to. So the next slide, please. So as a result of these war crimes trials, several interpreters were sentenced to death by hanging for the more serious accusations, such as the deaths of those 5 civilians. They were sentenced, but not actually hanged. Death sentences were commuted to life sentences to be served on Guam. And even those life sentences eventually got shortened several times until every single one of those interpreters was back in Saipan within 10 years or so. But the damaged relations were permanent for many people. Some interpreters who were released were told by their Guam guards, "Don't ever let your face be seen on Guam again." And I was told by some older people that whenever the Saipan flight came to Guam, this was in the 50s and the 60s, so the old Quonset hut type terminal in what was NAS Agana at the time. So I was told that when the Saipan flight came in those early decades after the war, so the memories and the wounds and the pain was still fresh in the hearts of many Guam Chamorros, they go up to see who was stepping off the Saipan plane. And this is how some Guam Chamorros made sure that some of these interpreters never came back. Next slide. So a big impact of the Saipan interpreter experience was the impact it had on the issue of Marianas unification or reunification. For years, the majority of people of the Northern Marianas wanted to politically integrate with Guam back in the 50s and 60s. Saipan wanted to unify at the time. So 3 plebiscites were held, and each time the Guam voters turned it down. The last plebiscite was held in 1969, and here are the figures. So you can see there in 1969, the last plebiscite held, there were 2,688 votes for unification and 3,720 votes against. So 58% of Guam voters turned it down. But of the 20,000 voters, less than 1/3 voted. So there's that caveat about how that vote represented the true feelings of the people, the voters of Guam. Of course, it could be argued that the reason why only 1/3 of the voters voted at all is because the majority weren't interested in the question, which kind of suggests that they weren't interested in unification. In the Northern Marianas, on the other hand, in 1969, there was 1,912 votes for unification, or 64%. And the turnout was higher. It was 60%, double that of Guam. So the issue was much more alive for the voters of the Northern Marianas than for Guam. And the next slide, please. So this third rejection by Guam voters in 1969, that ended any desire on Saipan's part to integrate with Guam. They were rejected 3 times, so after a while that begins to really, really hurt. So that was it. 1969 was the last. So Saipan went on its own way and later became, as we know, Saipan and Rota, a commonwealth of the US. And let's not forget the Northern Islands as well. Next slide. And the role of the interpreters during World War II was directly attributed to the results of the negative Guam vote. And so this is taken from a newspaper article of 1969. Officials here ascribed the adverse vote partly to local resentment of the role in World War II of the Northern Marianas, which then were ruled by Japan. People from the neighboring islands who speak the same language as the Guamanians, remember this is 1969, were used by the Japanese as interpreters here when Guam was under enemy occupation from December 41 until American forces retook the island in July of 44. Okay, next slide, please. So why did this happen? So the reason for bringing up this whole topic is to ask that question. Why did this happen? Why did 2 communities of Chamorros, the same race, language, culture, and even religion, end up with this problem? Many of the parents of these interpreters were born on Guam. So here's this Saipan interpreter, some of them being really rough with Guam Chamorros. And this Saipan interpreter's parents, both of them, were born on Guam. Juan Buco himself was born on Guam. So Juan Buco, who was the chief Chamorro interpreter, the highest, he was so high-ranking a Saipan interpreter that in a group photo of about 50 Japanese officials, he was, as far as we can tell, the only Chamorro in the picture, in the photo. So he was the chief interpreter for the police. So Juan Buco, he was singled out many times, as I've said, as one of the worst of the interpreters. He himself was born on Guam, but moved to Saipan as a child because his family moved up to Saipan. Most of the Saipan interpreters had relatives on Guam. One Saipan interpreter even said that he used to go to his aunt in Agate for meals. So how did this happen that people who are so closely related ended up with this problem? So the next slide. So in most cases, the Saipan interpreters were caught in a dilemma. They were caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. One choice was just as bad as the other. None of them, as far as we know, volunteered to be an interpreter on Guam. Most of them said they had no choice when requested by the Japanese to move to Guam. That request could not be denied. To do so would mean severe punishment or worse. One interpreter said that the Japanese even made him think that he was already in trouble with the Japanese for something he was accused of doing in Saipan. We know what you did, we're going to punish you severely, and there's only one way out. What's that? Go to Guam as an interpreter. So that was his ticket out of punishment, go to Guam as an interpreter. So on the one hand, they could not disobey Japanese orders or else they would be punished. And on the other hand, they had to participate in the punishment of their own people. So that was the dilemma. And so it was a no-win situation for many of the interpreters. Next slide. Once they were on Guam, the interpreters had to do what the Japanese ordered them to do, or else they in turn would be punished, and even worse than the Chamorros from Guam. Juan Buco is quoted as saying that when a Guam Chamorro does something wrong, he gets 1 lash from the Japanese. When a Saipan Chamorro does the same mistake, the Saipan Chamorro gets 10 lashes. The reason for that is because being under Japan since 1914, the Saipan interpreter, the Saipan Chamorro should know better, according to the Japanese thinking. The Japanese had higher expectations of the Saipan Chamorro. The next slide, please. We need to also understand that a number of Saipan interpreters tried to help. They walked a fine line between obeying the Japanese so that they themselves wouldn't get punished. This is the dilemma again, and showing as safely as possible their loyalty to their own people, the Chamorros of Guam. If they could do so safely, if they could help a Chamorro from Guam safely, tip them off that the Japanese knew something about you, so you better, clean up your act or protect yourself, they do it. One time a father and his 3 sons got lost twice in the jungle, both times coming upon the same platoon of Japanese soldiers. So naturally, the Japanese, seeing these same lost Chamorros 2 or 3 times, began to suspect these guys are spies. And the Japanese soldiers were about to eliminate these Chamorros. They started to suspect the spies, but it was a Saipan interpreter who, fortunately for these Guam Chamorros, the Saipan interpreter was there. And fortunately for them, this Saipan interpreter convinced the Japanese that these guys were just lost, and the Saipan interpreter directed them along another path and they weren't seen again. And so those guys, their lives were saved because of this Saipan interpreter's intervention. And that's just one example of many that I've heard over the years about how some Saipan interpreters tried to help out when they could. Next. One of the interpreters arrested and sentenced to do time explained the reality of the Saipan interpreters as they saw it. The interpreters on trial could write statements, and these words, originally in Chamorro, came from him. Our former government did not allow us freedom. I was forced to come to Guam, just as all the other Chamorros from Saipan. I was also a policeman in Saipan, and how we punished them there, we punished here. If we didn't punish as we were ordered, we would have been the ones punished. And this Saipan interpreter, in his written statement at the war crimes trial, goes on to say, even though I was punished on account of my job and my orders, I am also Chamorro and a Catholic, and perhaps I also gave them, my little screen is blocking the slide. I also gave them patience and charity. Okay, next slide, please. And let's take, for example, the famous case of Joe Ten of Saipan. He did business with all kinds of Guam Chamorro businessmen and women, and he traveled freely in and out of Guam after the war. And he was even given an honorary doctorate from the University of Guam, all for his support for that institution. But he was one of the Saipan interpreters. But he was one of those Saipan interpreters who fit the majority description of simply translating. So Joe Ten was not a police enforcer. He was simply an interpreter. And that's what most of them did. A small minority of interpreters were guilty of abusing their power. Some of them did really relish being in control. Again, the Japanese identified young men from Saipan who had that mentality. And so we have to admit that it did happen, but they were the minority. And let's not also forget to be very fair, to look at all the evidence, whether it be comfortable or not. Some Guam Chamorros got their fellow Guam Chamorros in trouble as well, including Father Dueñas, who was eventually executed. So people are people, no matter where they come from, no matter what their race or religion or ethnicity. Not everybody is an angel and not everybody is a demon. There's good and bad everywhere. And last slide. It seems that over the years, the wounds have been healing because we've had at least 2 senators born in Saipan who were elected by Guam voters to the Guam legislature. And so there we have, may rest in peace, Senator Pangilinan, and Adolfo Palacios is still with us. And these 2 had no problem getting elected to the Guam legislature by Guam voters, despite the fact that they were born in Saipan. So the wounds of World War II between Guam and Saipan have been healing over these years. And we can say for a long time now that we don't suffer significant lingering difficulties because of it. People from Guam go up and down to Saipan all the time and vice versa. People from Saipan get married to people from Guam. But when the topic of the Saipan and Rota interpreters comes up, and I'm sure it will in the future, I hope more of this information about the Saipan interpreters and the Rota interpreters, I hope more of that information gets out there, because we have to see the whole picture. We hopefully do this with every question in life. We try to look at all the information and to weigh them, because some bits of evidence are a little more important than others, and it's important to also put them together. How do they fit together? And that's what I've tried to do, given the limitations of our time. That's what I've tried to do in this short presentation. And now we can move, in the 10 minutes we have left, we can move to the next part of our time together.
Yeah, so thank you, Paul Eric, for the wonderful presentation. We have a couple of questions, but if anyone does have any more questions, please message to the questions in the chat box. But then we had one from Ken. So Ken, I am going to unmute you so you can ask your question directly. Ken, go right ahead.
Hey, Alpha Poly Eric, Ken Rages here. I really enjoyed your talk. My dad, Jose Tonko Rages, led the insurrection of the Chamorro people from Mauricio after Faja and Tinta massacres. I have to say that I could feel the resentment in his voice when he spoke about the people from Saipan. But just like you pointed out, he probably never really sat down and talked with them. So one of the things that I did ask him was there any women? And apparently that there was no women that the Japanese recruited. And so your loyalty piece, I mean, the Japanese had been in Saipan for about 30 years. So the Chamorros were used to them being there. However, why didn't they recruit women to try and win the hearts and the minds of the people on Guam, and then maybe switch their loyalty from, you know, Uncle Sam towards the Japanese empire?
I think I can only speculate because I've never actually seen that question asked in documentation, and so therefore it wasn't answered in documentation. But I can only speculate that because of the wartime conditions, it wasn't considered an asset to bring women interpreters or something else, another position perhaps. But I can imagine that had the war ended and peace came back, and had the war ended in Japan's favor, and Guam was now a Japanese possession, permanently, safely in Japanese hands, I'm pretty sure that women from Saipan would have come down. And indeed, during the occupation, there were a few Saipan women, as I mentioned. A Saipan woman came down to get married to her fiancé, whom she fell in love with before the war broke out.
Thank you, Paulo Eric. So Jaden actually had a question as well. So Jaden, I'm gonna unmute you right here.
Okay, perfect. Well, I just wanted to start off by thanking you for coming on here and talking to us about the Saipan interpreters. I found it really interesting. So my question was actually, how did you get involved about the subject?
My first introduction to the subject of the Saipan interpreters is a personal anecdote. It happened to be in my family. My grandmother's sister married a lawyer, Chamorro lawyer, who eventually became a judge. He was a lawyer before the war, a judge after the war. And during the Japanese occupation, the Japanese forced him, again, just like the Saipan interpreters say, you couldn't refuse the Japanese. So the Japanese came to him. He was the island attorney before the war, so he was a man of some stature. And during the war, everybody fled to their ranches. Ours was in Barragata. So they went to him and they said, you are now the soncho. I guess you could call him like a commissioner or modern day mayor. You are the soncho of Barragata. And your job, Mr. Regis, that was his name, Vicente Regis, your job is to make sure the Barragata farmers give us so many, bags of corn, so many bags of whatever. And if they don't, you get beat up. So my uncle Ben Regis, lived right next door to me all during my childhood. So I'd hear these stories about the Japanese and the Saipanese interpreters. And yet, again, just to show you that we can't, paint everybody with the same brush. And yet, despite what I heard about the rough Saipan interpreters, my uncle Ben took me with him as a teenager up to Saipan several times. And we stayed with another man up in Saipan by the name of Camacho, Vicente Camacho. And find out later that Vicente Camacho was one of the Saipan interpreters on Guam during the war. And so in my young teenage brain, I'm thinking, wait a minute, I thought the Saipan interpreters were the bad guys. And why are you so chummy with this Saipan interpreter? Well, as we begin to uncover the facts, the vast majority of Saipan interpreters just stayed out of it. They interpreted and tried to be as harmless as possible. And these friendships developed between Guam Chamorros and some Saipan interpreters. So that's what fascinated me about the question. It's, very simple, black and white questions are not all that interesting, but complex, multi-layered, multifaceted questions are much more interesting. And then when I went up to Saipan, when I was a priest in 1991 till 1994, so I had 3 years in Saipan, I was talking to some older men who had been interpreters and to their spouses, sometimes widows. So I would hear these stories firsthand.
Thank you, Paulo Eric. Actually, that's really the majority of the questions. Everyone's really just saying, thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation. So they all wanted to say that, and then I will allow that in a little bit, open up the unmute for everyone. But so I did want to say, on behalf of Pacific Historic Parks, we would like to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Paula, Eric, for presenting to everyone today. A recording of this presentation will be made available in the coming weeks at pacifichistoricparks.org. And you know, we are proud to and pleased to bring History Talks to audiences across the globe. Please help us to continue to share these historical presentations and other interpretive programs by supporting us through a monetary donation through the survey link found in the chat box. And then everyone, I am going to unmute right now so we can all say thank you to Paula, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you, Father.
Pleasure.